So, hello everyone. My name is Petri Alanko. I'm a composer and sometimes a sound designer and a producer. And some of you might know me by my moniker Lowland, but I'm probably most known from my work with especially Remedy Entertainment and their games Alan Wake's American Nightmare, and quite recently Quantum Break as well. I'm going to talk a little about Quantum Break soundtrack here, the choices, the directions, and the origins. The most important thing to me about everything, be that music or its raw ingredients, are the origins. The origins of the characters, the origins of the story, and thus the origins of the music and the sounds. It's all entwined together, and there are no separate entities, in my opinion. It's all become one. In this presentation, I'm going to play a lot of stuff that never made it through and was shelved forever, to give you a brief insight into my then world. And approximately only about 10 people, including me, have ever heard these tracks. Some of the material is probably going to sound a little bit embarrassing, well, at least to me, maybe even horrible, but it all leads to one goal, how it all eventually clicked into place, and what was really ticking in the background of the Riverport catastrophe, leading to the events described in Quantum Break. To me, the production of Quantum Break's soundtrack began in early May 2011, when a good friend of mine, Remedy's art director Saku Lehtinen, called me with a simple task to compose a little piece of music for a game pitch they were thinking about back then. And he arrived me at my place later the next day and showed me a few stills, and a very early and raw storyboard cinematic, not unlike the Max Payne comic stills. It was a series of pictures, actually. And I very quickly, while Saku sitting next to me, drafted out something according to his on-site guidance. It was there just to support the on-screen storyline and the events, and we were quite sure it will be just another wham bam, thank you ma'am, and disappear in the shelves forever. But it wasn't exactly true. But let me first play you some music for the clip, which was back then known as the pop art trailer because of, well, its looks. The sound could be a little bit louder. So there, that was the first piece I ever did for Quantum Break, which was then known as Q. It was very clear from the beginning that we had to take a total departure from Alan Wake's orchestral style. The events that set up the surroundings, they all kept echoing something different we had explored a few years earlier. And in Alan Wake, we had already boosted the orchestra with some supporting layers, the ratio being somewhere around 2/3 on the orchestra, or 1/3 on the electronics on selected pieces. And but here, the scale was going towards something much bigger and more dramatic, something quite different actually, because orchestra would be just raw material and dominated by processing, plugins, and whatever I happen to have in my rack. Also, I always wanted to use more guitar as a signal source, so the picture was getting somewhat clearer. And a little later, I got a white box clip of a longer cinematic with some animation and voiceovers too, which was a major step forward, albeit the graphics were just, well, white boxes. But the whole thing interpreted the idea really well. And after the very first seconds, music started playing in my head. I have to remind you that this piece was done according to action seen on screen, and without a clip, a proper clip, it will sound a little odd. Unfortunately, I cannot show you the then development movie. Some clever ones there in the audience might probably pick up something important from Remedy's methods from that. There are always some backwards engineers in the audience. But back then, the piece and the clip, they sort of clicked. So let's hear something. So there was me going all muse. The existence of guitar-bass drums combo in the beginning of this track was due to then plans. A lot of things changed in the plot eventually, and in the characters along the way. And I even considered doing the whole game soundtrack based on a 3-piece indie rock band. But I gave up the idea quite early on. You see, one of the first ideas was actually to have a rock band inside the game on a tour, facing all these events that would happen. But that was then for a short while. However, things and plans change, of course. But in this particular piece, the plans were still on, and although I couldn't show you the original movie clip, I must assure you that it was actually quite okay with Jack's epic Tom Cruise style run, stealthy action and combat and whatnot was on screen. And whereas Wake's important events took place in the open outdoors, in Quantum, the most important and epic twists at that time were happening either inside or at a close distance of these marvelous, grandiose open spaces and buildings from the classic era, old libraries, majestic church-like buildings filled with myriads of decorations and lush details. That was later on known as the old campus in Quantum Break, hard surfaces echoing and reflecting both light and sound. And on top of that, there was a time-traveling theme, which back then appealed to me a lot, which meant something else had to be brought in to broaden the narrow path and to support the obvious, utmost high-tech thingy. Some dreamlike quality to the sound. So three-piece rock band wasn't even nearly enough. Here's something that was done very early in December 2011. Please note the foggy feeling there and the processed electric piano ostinato. I felt that the piano was giving some ground underneath Jack's feet, as I felt Jack wasn't really at home anywhere. He was an outsider, reluctantly pulled into action. A long reverb. I happen to like those. By the way, that piece was meant to be played in case there ever would be a need for a slower sequence or any dreamlike vision or something similar. Sometimes I just imagine some events to which I'd compose a piece and let people decide whether it could be used or not. Well, because the manuscript wasn't final back then. Surprisingly a lot, though, got eventually used in the game and almost unchanged. At that development stage, there wasn't much to build on even, well, everything was in the making for a long time to be. So all I had were the images thrown at me by the initial story setting, the environment, the possible events taking place, and the characters. It was like people telling me stories, me staring at the campfire, letting my imagination loose. I loved the stories and the depth of the characters that were building and developing story by story. I did the following piece on my laptop in the Remedy cafeteria area based on the then storyline told to me by Saku. It was supposed to be a female fighter theme, supposedly used with a character that was somewhat complicated, even compromised in her early steps, then heading towards her goals and destiny, despite the more than possible grim fate awaiting. Her then considered fate created a route line for other characters relating to her. The ending is still up in the air a little bit, but I was so in a hurry due to approaching review. There was something that we did eventually use, but it was just a minor bit and was eventually heavily rearranged. To my surprise again was the amount of details that I could pick up from the clip, although I was using just a storyboard-like quick render. It's actually something Remedy is really good at, telling stories through picture. Every frame must count. Although I had no idea about the whole story, there was a connecting emotional layer, which was back then obvious enough to me to have my brain go tick, 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 tick all the time. I heard those stories. During the late 2011 and 2012, I quickly drafted a lot of stuff, and most of those pieces were used in the final production, and more and more analog synths were used, as well as my modular setup. Due to quick moves, there was no time to reinvent the wheel at that point, so we had to stick with what was handy, and the early compositions relied on my synths and rather vast sampler library mostly. But everything was supposed to be placeholders. No time for much thinking, just using your intuition and emphasizing something that was already there. Again, lots of on-screen action and stealthy stuff, money shots, so to speak. Yeah, but what was interesting was the realization, something that clicked very early on. In the end of this clip, which was later known as Q Walkthrough version 30, there were chords that survived throughout the whole Quantum Break production, and they surfaced every now and then. And I even tried to fit them in every possible cinematic along the way. only to find out it was inevitably a little bit too much and way too conclusion. So a heroic, empowering theme that has a promise of a continuum, like it was saying, you gotten through all this shit, but wait, there's more to this, both good and bad, but you might survive, might. A decisive, thorough piece that emphasizes the determination of our main character, who back then was supposed to be a female in this scene I was composing to. The chords eventually became the foundation of the future of Jack. However, in the end of Final Quantum Break, it still was Beth's theme too, sort of, because she was eventually Jack's motivation to change everything and even risk himself. Could we have the sound lead, please? I was talking about these chords, if you can hear them. So Beth knew Jack already, right from the start. She knew her fate, and when I heard that, it immediately brought me several ideas that are right now on the Quantum Break soundtrack. A good character is actually a gift that keeps on giving all the time throughout the whole development time, and probably could save a game even. As I mentioned, I would have wanted to use much more orchestral colors, but they didn't seem fit at all, and the fact was underlined throughout the early production. And the more Remedy added details to picture, the further away the orchestral colors were slipping. At this point, I wasn't sure even whether they were going to use my expertise in Quantum Break's final production phase, but I was just happy to see something cooking in their minds, and I was happy to feed their heads and provide something to, underline those thoughts. However, as it seems, they luckily took me on board a little later, officially, and it sure felt like home after Alan Wake and Alan Wake's American Nightmare. It's always been like that. I enjoy those guys really, really a lot. Now, that was the start. From the early days in the Quantum Break production, we had a certain list of references, sci-fi classics, dystopian masterpieces. It was never-ending, but yet very concentrated list, and selected artists and soundtracks that had certain important flavors, each of them bringing their little tiny snippets of DNA into what was supposed to become Quantum Break soundtrack and its backbone. At the early stages, some movies such as, The Road, Looper, Inception, and even Back to the Future, actually. They appeared every now and then, and some of due to their usage of sound effects instead of music, or sound effects as music. Well, all that, and then my history, which is a bit diverse, so to speak. Lots of classical music, classical piano, church organs, conducting lessons, orchestration. I played Satie, Saint-Saëns, Debussy, Chopin, lots of 80s synth rock, club music, house, acid, and even trance thrown in. But I never DJ'd. Somebody asked me yesterday whether I do a lot of DJ gigs. Well, I've never done one. I just lack that mindset. It requires special skills that I don't have. I've always been a fan of ostinatos and arpeggios, mostly thanks to Jean-Michel Jarre, Philip Glass, and Tangerine Dream. And in Quantum Break, the blurred colors of Satie and Debussy were mixed with patterns, ostinatos, and arpeggios. And, well, you could be rude and say that I built most of the soundtrack based on those heroic composers, and then combined it with some 70s post-kraut German synth rock and pop, and then later on the 80s synth rock. And about 4 hours worth of 10 guitars feedbacking through about a dozen amps, but that's another story. At some point I was asked to do something meandering and meditational, yet a little evil sounding, and dark piece that would begin small and end up towards a little bit of action along the way. Well, not much unlike the ones you heard. I used some of my analog stuff for that. And again, please note the ending chords here. They eventually resurfaced in the main sequence of the end cinematics main part. And if you play the game, I'm referring to the interrogation part. In this piece, they were supposed to underline Jack's doubtful facial expression, not unlike compared to the final cinematic. was composing for Alan Wake, I learned that I must definitely trust my instincts, intuition, and first impressions, and to keep the schedules, also forget the everlasting personal reiteration phase. There was something very precious about intuition and trusting your early first vision, and to keep on building on top of that. There's something we all musicians know as advertising agency around, which involves doing myriads of iterations of something, versions from A to Z and beyond, and then infamously, yet repetitiously, return to version A or B at maximum, because it was the most definitive one, the clearest rendition of your brilliant vision. I quite rarely step aside from the path of instincts, or rather the adaptive unconscious, if you like, which has nothing to do with Freud, by the way. I tend to rely on these first looks because they tell you exactly what you should feel like right there and then. It may take some time to learn to trust them and to remember exactly what you had in mind and what's the sequence of the events, but it all comes very natural after a while. I don't usually think while looking at something. I just concentrate on movements, facial gestures, character relations, power relations, goals of characters, and try to build an emotional layer, trying the whole scene together. I rarely remember anything from the voiceovers, but I, for some reason, always remember the exact timing of the clip and the atmosphere. When I was a kid, we used to play a lot of reaction and memory games with my first two performance-oriented piano teachers, who kept talking about how important it is to read and react, be it text or pictures. So their methods came actually quite handy years later when I did my first music-to-picture jobs. I understood at a very early age you don't have to play a gazillion notes in a second just to push your thoughts through. Only a few were enough if you were lucky, if you can provide the meaning and carry the emotion. A bit like Eric Clapton, who actually, according to my sources at least, has once said that there's no point of diddly-fiddling about a minute's worth of time when you can just hit the high G with some vibrato and bring through the emotion and your message. But on the other hand, something completely different. I was 12 at that time and training church organs at the time. I was very, very enchanted by classical romantic French organ composers, and one of my dearest favorites was Gabriel Piernet, and his prelude, opus 29, number 1, it was my personal major turning point after I discovered Piernet, thanks to my then teacher, Kalevi Kiviniemi, who happens to be a world-renowned concert organist. By the way, I'm sorry, but you really need to hear that piece. It takes only 3 minutes of your time, but you will carry it forever, trust me. Sorry about the Moira effect. Quantum Break is the fact that it's a combination of the environment, wind blowing through the pipes, producing sound, reflection, and the atmosphere. A bit like magnificent halls in Quantum Break. You can see that there were not that many, well, you can't see anymore, but you could see that there weren't that many notes in the sheet, but how they play together with the acoustics is just beautiful in every possible way. And considering the time when that piece was composed and performed for the first times, imagine how people have reacted to the sound back in the days when religion was #1 priority in their lives and everything beyond their comprehension was more or less magic and miracles. Quite profounding. Well, it's profounding and magic to me, even. I even had a multi-tracked organ, sampled and processed to death with different modulation and chorus ensemble units in the game as well, but it had to be taken away. It was underlining something too much, and it resurfaced in the soundtrack eventually, where I was able to use the longer original versions of the track. Was a character itself, and I thought it was the turning point of the mankind, a vessel of all destruction, more or less, and thus I felt it might have needed a theme of its own. However, the visual plans changed along the way, and so did the screenplay, and so I had to adjust accordingly. The Time Machine church organ, Infinite Mass, still exists, but only on the soundtrack, and in game there's just a really short piece of it, but we actually never forgot it. Speaking of characters, by the way, I tried to concentrate on the scoring effort through the most interesting character to me, the female protagonist, Beth, whose personal history was so brilliantly put together along with the rest of her story. She had this wonderful willowy quality to her appearance and capabilities, attitude, and person. I would describe it bending, not breaking, and kicking some serious ass along the way. Beth's history. She had had a childhood turning and profounding experience at the very early point of her life, and that put her in her tracks, that made her tick, made her prepare for the upcoming future. So in a way she was, to me, the original physical hero, following her path alongside Jack's somewhat reluctant newborn reactive hero, but together they made a brilliant pair, and there clearly was chemistry between them involved. Beth let go her ordinary life in order to fulfill something, and she said in one of her audio diaries, years of training leading to this moment. So she was practically on a mission. You must be getting the picture by now, I'm sure. As I said, to me, the innermost story of it all wasn't really about Jack and the antagonist Paul Serene, who appears in most pieces as feedbacking, hollow, whistling sounds, as he, well, after the peaceful intro, quite quickly becomes a mere shadow of himself, despite being increasingly powerful, yet disturbed due to the events and his change from a human being into something a bit different. The secondary story, however, was a story of two people being involved with each other in so many ways through time. In the game, we are being revealed what Jack says to Beth, knowing that he's probably breaking himself thoroughly doing it, but he swears to return. I'll come back for you. Saving her became Jack's priority. So gathering from all this, I wanted to create the ending piece from as few elements as possible. Of course, me being me, it got a little bit out of hand, but it's still an intimate, honest, and fragile piece. And you might remember the chord progression from the very early tracks I did for one of the video clips where Beth was originally involved as a hero. Those two conclusive chords. It landed right into the final cinematic of the game, and it felt clicking and fitting in an appropriate way right there. So the chord progression now ends the final cinematic of the Quantum Break, combining Jack and Beth, tying their fates together. The thing was right there all along the whole time, waiting for the right place and time. Now let's hear a whisper.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry, but we have time just for 2 questions from the audience. Anyone?
I have a question. What kind of analog synths do you use?
I actually don't know the exact number. My insurance company knows probably better. But during the production, I used several Moogs, Prophet 5, Prophet 6, Prophet 12, Korg MS-20, ARP Odyssey, Studio Electronics Omega 8, Studio Electronics SE1. Am I forgetting something? Probably I am. Oh, and the old Rolands. My first synth ever was Roland SH5A, which my father renovated. So it's still in use every now and then, and it still maintains its tuning quite well. Well, that's approximately the main gear, in addition to the modular synth, of course, but things like that. Nothing unusual.
Hi, I want to ask you, how closely did you work with game designers on developing the sound of Quantum Break, and how much free hand they gave you? Because from what I see, that you have much room for developing the sound.
The path I was walking along was actually quite narrow, and if I stepped too far away from the sides, I was quite sure that they might remind me every now and then. Luckily, that didn't happen too often. I was pretty close to the creative people, and actually, I almost on a daily basis visit Remedy's headquarters, to have lunch with guys. And I don't know. Although I'm an external, I spend quite a lot of time just loitering there and lying on the sofa, drinking their coffee and things like that. And every now and then some creative guy, let's say a graphic guy, goes by and I might ask a few questions. So I'm practically doing quite intense industrial spying there, just asking questions there and the other guy there, and it's combining little snippets.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for the great performance.